Hey guys, tonight we are stepping through a low timber door into the howling dark of a Viking winter, and I want you to feel every single second of it. The sting of the air, the weight of the silence, the particular misery of waking up at what should be morning but looks, sounds, and feels exactly like the middle of the night. Because in Scandinavia, somewhere around the 9th or 10th century, that is precisely what it is. You are not on a cozy longship adventure. You are not raising a horn of mead beside a roaring fire with a photogenic Norse warrior. You are horizontal on a wooden sleeping platform, under a pile of animal skins, in a building that is equal parts home, barn, and smoke-cured anxiety chamber. And the day has just begun. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, that is not even an exaggeration. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are right now, and what time it is locally. I genuinely love picturing all of you, tucked in across a dozen time zones, phone screens dimming, blankets pulled up, while I describe a world where your ancestors were busy trying not to freeze to death. It is a beautiful contrast, and I want to sit with it for a moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice before you open your eyes, before your brain has fully committed to the idea of consciousness, is the cold. Not the polite, brisk cold of a November morning when you have forgotten to turn the heating on. This is a cold with intention. It lives inside the longhouse the way a difficult relative lives in a spare bedroom. It has settled in, it has unpacked, and it is absolutely not leaving until April. The air bites the edge of your nose. It creeps under the animal hides you have arranged over yourself with the focused desperation of someone who understood, last night, that warmth was not a given. Your exhaled breath hangs above your face in a small, pale cloud, which is the Viking equivalent of a weather forecast, and this morning's forecast is bleak. You are in a Norse longhouse, and the word longhouse does a lot of heavy lifting as a description. It is technically accurate. It is long. It is a house. But those two facts together fail to capture what it actually means to be inside one. The structure stretches perhaps 20 to 30 meters from end to end. Its walls built from timber or turf depending on where exactly you are in the Norse world, whether that's coastal Norway, the wind-scoured shores of Iceland, or somewhere across the gray expanse of what will eventually be called the North Atlantic. The roof curves overhead like the upturned hull of a ship, which is either a poetic coincidence or a deliberate architectural callback to the thing Norse people trusted most, depending on which historian you ask. The walls slope inward. The ceiling, at its peak, is not generous. You are not standing upright easily unless you are near the center, and even then you are sharing that precious vertical space with hanging tools, drying herbs, strips of cured meat, and a permanent haze of wood smoke that has been accumulating since approximately last October. There is a central hearth. This is the non-negotiable heart of the longhouse, a long fire pit running down the middle of the main room, currently reduced overnight to a bed of orange coals that glow like tired eyes in the dimness. Someone, not you because you have only just arrived and have not yet earned any chores, will need to feed that fire within the next few minutes. If the fire goes out entirely, the consequences cascade quickly and badly. The fire is not ambience. The fire is the difference between a functioning household and a very atmospheric tragedy. The light in here is minimal. There are no windows in the modern sense, no glass, no clear openings to the outside. What light exists filters through a smoke hole in the roof, which is simultaneously the chimney, the skylight, and the source of a slow, constant draft that makes the smoke mostly go upward and only occasionally directly into your face. Mostly. Outside that smoke hole, the sky is the color of an old bruise, because it is somewhere around 8 in the morning in mid-January and the sun, at this latitude, is not so much rising as briefly appearing on the horizon, squinting at the landscape and immediately beginning to set again. You will get perhaps 5 to 6 hours of functional daylight today. Not bright, cheerful daylight, diffuse, pale, navigable if you're lucky daylight. The kind of daylight that does the bare minimum. Historians still argue whether the Norse psychological relationship with winter darkness was one of resignation, spiritual meaning-making, or something more complex. a culturally embedded endurance that modern researchers have tried and largely failed to fully decode from the outside. What we do know is that they did not simply suffer through the dark. They built their entire ritual and social calendar around it. The long nights were not empty. They were full of stories, of craft, of the kind of slow, firelit work that needed no sun. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. You have not even sat up yet. You sit up. This is a mistake you will not repeat quickly. The air above the sleeping platform is noticeably colder than the air under the hides, in the same way that jumping into a fjord is noticeably colder than not jumping into a fjord. Your sleeping area is a raised wooden bench along the interior wall of the longhouse, wider than it sounds, padded with straw and covered in wool blankets and fur skins, and shared. Privacy in the Norse winter longhouse is a concept so alien it does not have a direct Old Norse equivalent in practice. You have been sleeping near other people, family members, possibly farmhands, and depending on the size of the household and the severity of the winter, possibly some of the smaller livestock occupying the partitioned far end of the building. You can hear them, the animals. There is a particular low, patient sound that a cow makes in the pre-dawn cold that is simultaneously comforting and deeply humbling when you realize it is coming from inside your home. The people around you are in various stages of waking. The Norse did not, as a rule, treat sleep as something to be extracted from in stages with a gentle alarm and a cup of coffee. You woke when the household woke, which was when the work demanded it, which in winter was darker and colder than any reasonable person would choose. The woman nearest the hearth, likely the housewife, the husfrige, whose authority over the domestic interior of a Norse household was considerable and legally codified, is already moving. She is the first fully upright person in the room, which is both a statement of duty and a demonstration of a kind of practical courage that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically gets in the popular imagination of Viking life. You watch her, from your pile of hides, and you make a quiet, private decision to not be the last person standing up. Social dynamics in a Norse household were not vicious exactly, but they were legible. Everyone understood where they stood, what was expected of them, and what it meant when you were the person still horizontal while everyone else was at work. You do not want to be that person. You have been in this longhouse for approximately 4 minutes and you already understand this instinctively, which suggests that human social anxiety may be one of our most durable traits across the centuries. You swing your legs over the edge of the sleeping bench and your feet find the floor, which is hard-packed earth, sometimes covered in straw or dried heather, sometimes not, but either way it is not warm, and your feet register this information immediately and in considerable detail. You do not have slippers. Nobody in this building has slippers. What you have, if you are lucky and organized, is a pair of shoes made from untanned leather that have been sitting on the cold floor all night and are therefore exactly as warm as the floor, which is to say, not warm. You put them on anyway because the alternative is worse, and this is going to be a recurring theme today. Every option is worse than the one you wish you had. The longhouse itself is already beginning to fill with the sounds and smells of morning. The fire is being coaxed back to life. Someone has added dried peat, which catches slowly and produces a smoke that is thick and organic, layering itself over the existing smoke that has, over the course of a long winter, worked its way into every surface, every textile, every breath. Archaeologists examining Norse longhouse sites have found evidence of this persistent smoke in the very timbers of the structures themselves, preserved across 1,000 years. You are living inside a building that is slowly being cold-smoked, and you are part of the process. You will smell like this fire for the rest of the day. So will everyone else. At a certain point, it stops being noticeable, which is its own kind of adaptation. A quirky footnote to the longhouse hearth. There is evidence from certain Norse sites suggesting that the central fire was considered to have a kind of spiritual presence. Not quite a deity, but a force with personality, something that needed to be treated with respect and managed with intention. Letting a household fire go completely cold was not just a practical failure. It carried a faint but real social and symbolic weight. The suggestion that the household itself had lost its cohesion, its warmth in the broader sense. You do not know this yet, standing in your cold shoes beside your cold sleeping bench. But the fact that the fire is still alive this morning is not nothing. It means last night went well. It means someone was paying attention. In a Norse winter, that is the foundational unit of survival. Someone was paying attention. The light is changing almost imperceptibly. Through the smoke hole overhead, the darkness is shading from absolute to something merely very deep. Outside the longhouse, the landscape is doing what a Scandinavian January landscape does with total commitment and zero apology. It is being hostile. The temperature overnight has likely dropped to somewhere between -10 and -20 Celsius in a typical Norse winter. Not the extreme cold of further north, not the comparative mildness of the lower latitudes, but a solid, dependable, structural cold that has frozen the ground to iron hardness, locked the fjord edges in shelf ice, and turned any exposed moisture, your breath, water left in a bowl, the condensation on the interior walls of the longhouse, into frost. You are going to go outside today, multiple times. You are going to stand in that cold and work in that cold and travel in that cold if traveling is required, and your entire preparation for doing so consists of what you are wearing and what you can layer on top of it. We will get to the clothing in detail shortly, because it deserves its own careful attention. The Norse approach to dressing for winter is genuinely impressive and occasionally bizarre, and we are going to walk through all of it together. But for now, standing at the threshold of your first Viking winter morning, still holding the remnant warmth of your sleeping hides around you like a memory, you are beginning to understand something fundamental. This life is not harsh because people were careless or unlucky or technologically primitive in the way we sometimes lazily assume. It is harsh because the environment is genuinely, measurably, climatologically difficult, and the people who chose or were born into the necessity of living here built an entire culture around the project of enduring it, not escaping it, not dreaming of somewhere warmer, though the Norse certainly knew warmer places existed and traveled to them with impressive regularity. Enduring it, finding the grain of meaning inside the longest, coldest, darkest season and pressing on through it until the light came back. The Husfrija calls something across the room. You do not speak Old Norse with anything approaching fluency, but the tone is universal. It is the tone of mourning. It is the tone of there is work, and the work will not wait, and everyone in this building knows what they are supposed to be doing, and she would like to see evidence of that happening sometime before the brief and grudging daylight disappears again. You straighten up as best you can in the low-ceiling dimness. Your breath still clouds in front of you. The fire is catching now, throwing its first real light across the curved walls of the longhouse, illuminating the hanging tools and the sleeping shapes of the people around you and the dark, patient eyes of the cow at the far end, who has been awake longer than anyone and has opinions about the morning that she is choosing to keep to herself. You are here. You are upright. You are cold, but you are inside, and the fire is going, and the day short, gray, relentless, and completely unlike anything in your previous experience, is beginning. You are going to need better clothes. The clothes situation is, to put it charitably, a project. You are standing in a Norse longhouse in the gray pre-dawn of a January morning, and the question of what to put on your body is not a casual one. It is not a quick scan of a wardrobe followed by a sensible decision. It is a layering exercise with real stakes, the kind where getting it wrong does not mean you are a little chilly at the bus stop. It means your fingers stop working, your judgment quietly degrades, and the cold begins to make decisions on your behalf. The Norse understood this with the clarity that comes from generations of direct, unambiguous feedback. Their clothing system was not fashion. It was engineering. Let's start from the ground up, which is traditionally the sensible place to start and is especially important here because the ground, as you have already discovered with your bare feet this morning, is conducting cold upward into your body with impressive efficiency. Your footwear begins with wool socks. Not delicate, decorative wool, but dense, tightly woven material that has been fulled, meaning it has been deliberately shrunk and compressed through heat and agitation until it becomes almost felt-like, thick enough to hold its structure and trap air. Air is the secret ingredient in all pre-industrial cold-weather clothing, and the Norse knew this empirically even without the vocabulary of thermal insulation. Dead air, air that is not moving, air caught in the weave of a fabric or between two layers, is what keeps you alive. Your socks are trapping air. This is their primary job, and they are reasonably good at it. Over the socks go your shoes, those leather constructions you encountered this morning in their overnight cold state. Norse footwear from the period, as recovered from waterlogged archaeological sites across Scandinavia and the Norse settlements of the British Isles, ranged from simple turn shoe constructions, where the leather is sewn inside out and then flipped, creating a smooth exterior, to more complex ankle boots with toggle fastenings. The leather is typically cowhide or sheepskin, and it has been treated with animal fat, tallow usually, worked into the hide to keep it supple and give it some degree of water resistance. The key phrase there is some degree. Your shoes will resist a light frost. They will manage damp ground for a reasonable period. They will not survive a plunge into a half-frozen stream, and if the snow gets deep enough to pour over their tops, you are going to discover a new definition of cold that starts at your ankle and radiates inward. You make a mental note to watch where you step. Wrapping your lower legs are wool leg wraps, essentially long strips of woven wool wound in a spiral from ankle to knee, a technique that appears across multiple Northern European cultures of the period and serves several functions simultaneously. They hold your trouser legs in place, add a layer of insulation over the area where your boots end and your legs begin, a region of the body that is otherwise an excellent cold air entry point, and provide some structural support on uneven terrain. They are fiddly to apply correctly, and they take practice to keep from unraveling at inopportune moments, such as while carrying something heavy across an icy yard, which is exactly the kind of moment you have coming up. You wrap them as best you can. They will loosen by midday. Everyone's due. Your trousers are wool, again the fulled, dense variety, cut looser than modern trousers and tied at the waist with a cord. The looseness is intentional. Tight clothing restricts circulation, and restricted circulation in extreme cold is a fast road to numb extremities, which is itself a fast road to much worse things. Norse practical clothing was consistently cut with movement in mind, because standing still for warmth was not a strategy available to people who had animals to tend, firewood to split, and a farm that did not pause for personal comfort. You move, you generate heat, and your clothing needs to be able to accommodate both the movement and the heat without binding or chafing. The wool against your skin is not as scratchy as you feared. Good wool, well processed, is softer than its reputation, but it is not nothing, and by the end of the day you will have a new appreciation for every modern synthetic base layer that has ever existed. Over the trousers and a wool undershirt comes your tunic, a long, roughly T-shaped garment reaching mid-thigh or below, belted at the waist. The belt is important. The belt is not decorative or not only decorative. It is where you hang the things you need constant access to: a knife, a small pouch, any tool specific to your morning work. The knife, by the way, is not a weapon in the dramatic sense, though it can be if needed. It is a utility tool of the first order, the Norse equivalent of having functional thumbs. You use it for food, for fiber work, for cutting leather and rope, for 100 small tasks that arise between sunrise and the barely distinguishable event that passes for sunset. You are not considered properly dressed without it. A Norse person without a belt knife is like a modern person without a phone, except the knife is actually useful in an emergency. Now comes the outer layer, which is where Viking clothing starts to look most familiar to the popular imagination and most different from what the popular imagination assumes. You are not putting on gleaming armor. You are not draping yourself in dramatic furs with visible clasps at the shoulder. What you are reaching for is a cloak, a large, rectangular or semicircular piece of heavy wool, fastened at the right shoulder with a pin or brooch, leaving the right arm free for work. The cloak is your primary defense against wind, and wind at this latitude and this season is not a minor consideration. Wind takes your carefully constructed cocoon of trapped air insulation and simply removes it, replacing it with moving cold air that pulls heat away from your skin approximately 4 times faster than still air of the same temperature. The cloak interrupts this process. It is also, in extremis, a blanket, a ground cover, a sail patch, and a privacy screen. It works hard. You will be grateful for it within approximately 45 seconds of stepping outside. There is, however, a wrinkle in the cloak situation that points to something fascinating about Norse material culture. And it is this: the wool used in Norse outer garments was frequently treated with lanolin, the natural oil in sheep's wool, preserved rather than washed out during processing, which gave the fabric a degree of water resistance that modern tests on reconstructed textiles have confirmed is genuinely significant. Rain and light snow bead on the surface of a lanolin-rich will cloak in a way that is almost waterproof for the first hour or so of exposure. This was not an accident. Norse weavers, and the evidence strongly suggests these were predominantly women managing a technically complex and economically central craft, understood what they were doing. The textile industry in Norse society was not a domestic afterthought. It was a foundational economic and survival technology. And historians still argue whether the full scale and sophistication of Norse textile production has been adequately represented in the broader narrative of what made Norse expansion and settlement possible, with some researchers suggesting that sales alone, which required enormous quantities of high-quality woven wool, represent a manufacturing achievement that should be ranked alongside the longship itself. On your head goes a wool cap, simple, close-fitting, covering the ears. You are losing an enormous percentage of your body heat through your uncovered head right now, which is a fact your body is communicating clearly, and the cap addresses this in the most direct way possible. There is evidence for a range of more elaborate headgear in the Norse world: fur-lined caps, hoods attached to cloaks, various regional styles, but the baseline is wool, fitted, covering the ears, and it is non-negotiable. The image of the horned Viking helmet, while we are on the subject of Norse headwear, is one of history's most durable and most completely wrong popular myths. Norse warriors in combat wore simple iron or leather helmets, sometimes with a nose guard. They did not wear horns, which would have made fighting impractical in ways too numerous to list. The one genuinely horned helmet associated with the Norse world, the Vexo helmet, found in a Danish bog, is now believed to predate the Viking age by over 1,000 years and was almost certainly ceremonial rather than martial. Your wool cap, humble as it is considerably more accurate. Your hands are covered by mittens, not gloves, because mittens are warmer. This is not a matter of preference. Mittens keep your fingers together, sharing heat, rather than isolating them in individual fabric tubes where they lose warmth independently. If you are doing work that requires fine motor control, and much of the work of a Norse winter does, you will need to take a mitten off, do the thing, and get the mitten back on as quickly as possible. Your bare hand in January air at -15 degrees has roughly 3 to 5 minutes before dexterity starts to degrade. You learn to work quickly with one exposed hand. Everyone does. The full outfit, layered and assembled, is heavier than you expected and warmer than you hoped. Meaning it is providing warmth, but perhaps not quite as much as you would wish for. And the weight of it all is noticeable in a way that reminds you that every step today will be slightly more effortful than it would be in modern technical outerwear. But here is the thing about wool, the thing that makes it genuinely remarkable and explains why it remained the dominant cold-weather fabric in Northern Europe from prehistory through the early modern period. It continues to insulate when wet. Not as well as when dry, nothing insulates as well wet as dry, but meaningfully, substantially better than any plant-based fabric and incomparably better than a modern cotton garment soaked through. A wet Norse wool tunic is uncomfortable. A wet modern cotton t-shirt in the same conditions is actively dangerous. This is not a small distinction. This is the distinction between a bad afternoon and a medical emergency. There is one more layer to consider, one that you might not have thought of, and one that marks a pragmatic attitude toward available resources that runs through almost every aspect of Norse winter life. Animal fat, not worn as clothing exactly but applied, to the face particularly, to the hands. The exposed skin of a Norse person heading out into a January wind was not bare and unprotected in the way that modern skin is when we step outside. Tallow, rendered animal fat, applied to the face creates a barrier against wind and moisture that reduces the rate of heat loss from exposed skin and provides some protection against the cracking and splitting that dry cold air causes on unprotected skin. It smells like what it is. After about 10 minutes, you stop noticing. After a week, you would feel underprepared without it. You are now dressed. You are also, if we are being honest with each other, already a little tired from the process, which required thought and effort and the cooperation of cold, stiff fingers, and you have not yet done anything that actually counts as the day's work. The Husfrija has noticed you are now upright and clothed, and she has, without particular ceremony, communicated through the efficient shorthand of a household where everyone has a role, that there is something specific that requires your attention. This is both reassuring, at least you are not expected to invent your own purpose, and faintly daunting because the task involves going outside, and outside is an environment you are now dressed for but have not yet directly encountered this morning. Somewhere near the entrance of the longhouse, beside the heavy door that has been doing its imperfect best to keep the exterior world exterior, Someone has left a pair of crude snowshoes, flat, woven frames designed to distribute your weight across the surface of compacted snow rather than plunging through it with every step. Whether you will need these depends on last night's accumulation, which you cannot assess from here, but the fact that they are placed where you can see them is itself information. It snowed. It snowed enough that someone thought about the snowshoes. You pull your cloak tighter. You check the belt knife out of instinct, even though you are not entirely sure what you would use it for in the next 10 minutes. You take a breath of warm, smoky, animal-scented longhouse air. Air that 20 minutes ago seemed overwhelming and now, in comparison to what is on the other side of that door, seems almost luxurious. The door is a heavy wooden construction, low enough that you duck automatically. It opens inward because a door that opens outward in a region with serious snowfall is a door that occasionally traps you inside, and the Norse were practical people who had thought through exactly these kinds of scenarios. You open it. The cold does not ease into the room. It arrives. The cold arrives like a living thing. It does not wait for you to step outside. It pours through the open doorway the moment you crack it, displacing the smoky warmth of the longhouse with the particular, clean, aggressive cold of a Scandinavian January morning, and for a moment you simply stand in the threshold, one hand on the door frame, blinking into a world that is simultaneously more beautiful and more hostile than anything your nervous system was fully prepared to process at this hour. The landscape outside is white, not the patchy, apologetic white of a light urban snowfall that melts on contact with road surfaces and disappears by afternoon. This is structural white, committed white, the white of a world that has fully converted to a different operating system and is no longer running any of the summer software you are used to. Snow has settled deeply over the farmstead, over the outbuildings, over the woodpile, over the fence posts, rounding every hard edge into something softer and more treacherous, because the softened edge is hiding the hard thing underneath. And in a farmyard in winter, the hard things include axe handles, frozen animal dung, uneven ground, and the low lip of the ice-locked water trough that you are absolutely going to catch your foot on before this morning is over. The sky above is the color of pewter, a flat, undifferentiated gray that is beginning, very gradually, to separate itself into something slightly lighter near the southern horizon, which is where the sun will make its brief, low appearance sometime around mid-morning. It will not climb high. At this latitude in January, the sun at noon is approximately where the sun sits about an hour after sunrise in a temperate climate, hanging low, casting long shadows, illuminating rather than warming. The angle is too shallow to deliver meaningful heat. It delivers light, and light is not nothing. Light is genuinely valuable psychologically and practically. But if you are standing here waiting for the sun to take the edge off the cold, you are going to be waiting in a way that rearranges your understanding of what waiting means. Your breath billows out in front of you in a dense, theatrical cloud that the light catches and then immediately disperses. Your nose, which has been living comfortably indoors, registers the outside air as a kind of shock. It is so dry and so cold that your first few inhaled breaths have a quality almost like breathing glass, a faint, stinging clarity that is completely unlike the damp warmth of the longhouse interior. Your eyes water slightly. This is automatic, physiological. Your tear ducts attempting to protect your corneas from drying in the cold air, and the slight moisture immediately chills against your lower lashes and makes you blink. Everything about stepping outside in a Norse January is your body making rapid-fire adjustments, and most of them feel like minor complaints. You are outside because there is food to think about. Specifically, the ongoing, complex, never quite resolved project of feeding a household through a season when nothing grows. Nothing can be easily hunted in deep snow, and the supplies stored since autumn are in a constant, quiet negotiation between what is needed and what remains. The Norse relationship with winter food is one of the most fascinating and most genuinely challenging aspects of life in this period, and it begins not with cooking but with what happened months ago, in the busy, urgent autumn when every decision about preservation was being made with this exact morning in mind. The first thing to understand about Norse winter food is that almost none of it is fresh in any sense that your modern palate would recognize. Freshness, as a culinary value, is a luxury of seasons and climates that allow for it. What the Norse had instead was a sophisticated, multi-system approach to preservation that drew on smoke, salt, fermentation, drying, and cold storage, often in combination, and the results ranged from, to put it diplomatically, an acquired taste, to things that were genuinely, surprisingly good if you approached them on their own terms rather than measuring them against expectations formed in a world with refrigeration. Smoke is where we start because smoke is everywhere and it is doing more work than you realized. The longhouse itself, as you have already discovered, is perpetually smoke-cured. Not just the air but the surfaces, the hanging textiles, the wooden structures overhead. And hanging from those smoke-darkened rafters, in many Norse longhouses, were the cured meats and fish that represented a significant portion of the household's winter protein. Whole fish, split and dried and smoked. Haunches of mutton or pork from the autumn slaughter. The slaughter that happened when the animals too numerous to feed through winter were killed and preserved rather than depleted further of their stored weight on scarce feed. Smoked meat in this context has a flavor profile that is dense, intensely savory, and deeply strange to a modern palate accustomed to refrigeration. It is, in the technical sense, slightly fermented as well as smoked, aged in the warm-cool-warm fluctuations of a living hearth environment. And it is both more complex and more confrontational than anything you would find labeled smoked in a contemporary supermarket. For breakfast, and we should use that word loosely, because the Norse did not necessarily organize their eating around the same rigid morning-noon-evening structure that later European cultures formalized, you are most likely looking at a combination of things that require varying degrees of preparation and varying degrees of enthusiasm to consume. There is porridge, almost certainly. Grain porridge, made from barley or oats or rye depending on what was grown locally and what survived storage, cooked over the hearth fire in a heavy iron or soapstone pot that has been doing this job for years. The porridge is thick, slightly smoky from the cooking environment, and filling in the way that dense carbohydrates are filling. It sits in you like ballast, which is exactly what it is intended to do. You are going to burn a significant number of calories today doing physical work in cold air, and your body needs something substantial to begin the process. The porridge is that something. It is not interesting. It is fuel, and you eat it from a wooden bowl with a wooden spoon while standing near the fire, and you are grateful for it even as part of your brain, the part still connected to your memory of breakfast in a different century, is quietly composing a formal complaint. With the porridge, or alongside it, there may be bread, dense, dark, unleavened or minimally leavened flatbread made from coarsely ground grain that has been stored since harvest. Norse bread was not the airy, risen loaf of later European baking traditions. It was heavy, substantial, slightly gritty from the stone milling process, and had a flavor that was genuinely earthy and complex in a way that modern artisan bread makers have spent considerable effort trying to recreate. It was also hard enough, when dried fully, to be stored for extended periods without spoiling, which made it a practical choice for winter provisions. You tear a piece off and eat it. It is chewy in a way that your jaw notices. It tastes of grain and smoke and something mineral that you cannot immediately identify, and it is not bad. It is just very, very different from the breakfast reality you are used to, in the same way that a long winter walk is very, very different from a gentle stroll. Now we need to talk about the fermented fish, because there is no honest account of Norse winter food that avoids it, and I am not going to be the narrator who glosses over it for the sake of audience comfort. Fermentation was one of the primary preservation strategies in the Norse world, applied to dairy products, grains, vegetables, and, most notably for the purposes of modern sensory discomfort, fish. Fermented fish was not a marginal or unusual element of the Norse diet. It was central. It was reliable. It lasted. And the process of making it involves allowing fish to break down partially through controlled bacterial action, which produces a protein-dense, extremely pungent product that the Norse considered entirely normal and entirely appetizing, and which the modern nose, encountering it without preparation, tends to experience as an event rather than a food. The closest modern descendant of this tradition is the Scandinavian lutefisk, or, more accurately, the Icelandic hakarl, fermented Greenlandic shark, which is still produced and eaten, and which visiting outsiders consistently describe in terms that would be more appropriate for a chemical weapons discussion than a meal review. You are probably not eating hakarl this morning, but you may be eating something in the same family: fermented herring or dried and partially fermented cod, reconstituted in water overnight and now offering itself to you in the bowl beside the porridge with what can only be described as aggressive confidence. You eat it. It is very strong. It is, once your palate adjusts, genuinely nutritious and calorie-dense, and exactly what a person doing hard physical labor in extreme cold needs in terms of protein and fat content. The Norse were not eating this because they had no other options. They were eating it because it worked, and because their palates had been calibrated to it from childhood, and because in a world without refrigeration, learning to love what keeps is a survival skill as fundamental as knowing how to build a fire. Historians still argue whether the degree of fermentation in Norse preserved fish products was a consistent, intentional technique or whether it varied significantly by region, household, and circumstance, with some researchers suggesting that what we call fermentation was sometimes simply the unavoidable result of preservation conditions that were difficult to control precisely, and that the Norse relationship with the resulting product was more pragmatic than the word traditional implies. Either way, the fish is in front of you, and pragmatism is what the morning requires. Dairy, if the household's animals are producing at this time of year, enters the picture in the form of skyr, a fermented dairy product that is closer to strained yogurt than to cheese, thick and slightly sour and rich in protein, which the Norse made and consumed in quantities that archaeological evidence suggests was significant. Skyr has survived into modern Iceland almost unchanged from its medieval form, which is either a testament to how good it was or to how resistant Icelandic food culture is to outside suggestions, and possibly both. If you are lucky this morning, there is a clay pot of it near the hearth, where it has been kept from freezing, and you scoop some onto your bread and discover that it is actually quite good, tangy and substantial and something your body recognizes as nourishing in a straightforward, uncomplicated way. It is the least challenging thing you have eaten since arriving, and you appreciate it with a sincerity that surprises you. The management of the winter food supply was not left to chance or to daily improvisation. It was structured, anticipated, and carefully governed, and the person governing it was almost always the husfrija, the woman of the household, who carried the keys to the storage areas literally on her person, hanging from her belt or brooch as both a practical tool and a symbol of authority. The keys were not decorative. They opened real locks on real storage chests and outbuildings, and the woman who carried them was the person making daily decisions about how much of the winter stores could be spent today versus conserved for the week still ahead. This was not a simple calculation. It required a kind of rolling mental accounting, current inventory against projected need against the uncertainty of how long winter would actually last, that had to be recalibrated constantly and got it wrong sometimes, with consequences that were serious and occasionally catastrophic. Storage itself was distributed across several locations with different temperature profiles, because different foods needed different conditions. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and others went into underground storage pits where the earth held a temperature just above freezing, cold enough to slow decay without freezing the vegetables themselves. Dried and smoked meats hung in the longhouse's upper air, where the smoke and warmth from the hearth created conditions that extended their preservation. Dairy products needed careful management to prevent either freezing or spoiling. Grain was stored in elevated, sealed containers designed to exclude rodents, which were a persistent threat to winter food supplies in a way that no amount of household cats entirely solved, though the Norse certainly kept cats for this purpose and took them seriously enough that cat remains are regularly found at Norse settlement sites across the North Atlantic. The water situation requires its own brief, honest moment of attention, because fresh water in a Norse winter is not something you simply turn on. The nearest stream may be partially or fully frozen. The water trough is frozen solid this morning. You can see the gray disk of ice on its surface from where you are standing in the yard, and it will need to be broken before the animals drink, which requires a tool and some physical effort and a resigned relationship with the fact that this is a chore that will happen every morning until spring, and there is no version of it that is not cold and inconvenient. Collected snow can be melted for water, but it takes a lot of snow to produce a small amount of water, and the fuel cost of melting it has to be weighed against the longhouse's overall heat management budget. You collect water from the least frozen point of the nearby stream, using a wooden bucket, navigating the icy bank with the careful, weight-testing steps of someone who has already mentally calculated the consequences of falling in and found them unacceptable. The food situation, seen whole, is a picture of sophisticated management operating under genuine constraint. The Norse were not improvising desperately from day to day. They had systems. Those systems were built from generations of experience with exactly these conditions, refined and transmitted and improved upon across lifetimes of winters. But the systems operated with thin margins, particularly in a bad year, a summer drought that reduced the harvest, an early frost that shortened the growing season, an illness in the livestock that reduced the autumn slaughter, and the line between a well-managed winter and a hungry one was not always as wide as you would want it to be. The Norse word for this particular anxiety does not translate neatly into modern English, but it lived in every decision the Husfrija made when she opened the storage chest, counted what remained, and calculated how many more weeks of cold lay between the household and the return of the light. You finish your breakfast standing by the fire, holding your wooden bowl with both hands for the warmth it transfers, listening to the sounds of the household organizing itself around the morning's tasks. Outside, the pale light is strengthening slightly. The animals at the far end of the longhouse are making their presence felt with increasing enthusiasm. The fire needs more wood. The water needs to be brought. The day is not waiting, has never been waiting, is constitutionally incapable of waiting, and the food in your stomach, porridge and dark bread and fermented fish and a spoonful of skyr, is the fuel on which all of what comes next is going to run. You set the bowl down. The Husfrija hands you something without looking up from her own work. A second bucket, heavier than you expected, with a purposeful weight that communicates clearly that it is meant to be filled, carried, and put to use. You take it. You adjust the strap of your cloak against the cold that is still seeping through the open doorway where someone has propped it ajar. Probably the same optimistic individual who laid out the snowshoes and believes, with touching conviction, that you know what you are doing. You are full. You are cold. You are holding a bucket. The morning, such as it is, has properly begun. The longhouse, when you step back inside with your filled bucket, is a different place than it was 20 minutes ago. Not physically different, the dimensions are the same, the smoke is the same, the low ceiling and the curved walls and the central hearth are all exactly where you left them. But the household has shifted into its daytime configuration, and the difference is one of density and motion and the particular, layered noise of many lives operating in close proximity without any of the spatial relief that modern people take entirely for granted. There are, by your rough count, somewhere between 12 and 20 people in this building, plus the animals at the far end, plus everything those people own and use and are in the middle of working on, and all of it exists within a footprint that a modern real estate listing would describe, with heroic understatement, as cozy. You set the bucket down where it is gestured toward and take a moment, just a moment because moments are not particularly available this morning, to look at the space properly. Really look at it. Because the Norse longhouse is one of those historical environments that popular culture has simultaneously over-romanticized and under-imagined, and the reality of it, seen from the inside on a winter morning, is stranger and more compelling than either the dramatic mead hall of the movies or the primitive hovel of the condescending historical summary. The longhouse is divided informally into zones, each with its own function and its own social meaning. The hearth runs centrally, a long rectangle of carefully managed fire that is the thermal and practical spine of the entire structure. Along the long walls are the raised sleeping and sitting platforms, the ones you woke up on this morning, which serve as beds at night and as work surfaces and seating during the day. A dual function that means the boundary between sleeping space and living space is not a door or a wall, but simply a time of day. Your sleeping area is now someone's weaving station. The transition happened without ceremony, because ceremony requires space and surplus time, both of which are currently allocated elsewhere. At one end of the longhouse, the end with the main entrance, slightly separated from the primary living area, there may be a small anteroom or entryway, a buffer zone between the exterior cold and the interior warmth that serves the same function as a modern mudroom, which is to say it catches some of the cold air that would otherwise pour directly into the living space every time someone opens the door, and it stores the wet, muddy, snow-covered outer garments that you do not want dripping onto the earthen floor any closer to the fire than necessary. At the other end, separated by a low partition or simply by understood spatial convention, are the animals. The animals are important. The animals are not an afterthought or a primitive arrangement that the Norse would have preferred to avoid if they had better options. The animals are in the longhouse deliberately because their body heat, the slow, reliable metabolic warmth of cattle and sheep and goats going about the business of being alive, contributes meaningfully to the overall thermal budget of the structure during the coldest months. This is not a detail that appears in most popular accounts of Viking life, but it is a real and significant one. A cow produces a substantial amount of body heat. Several cows, several sheep, some goats, perhaps a pig or two. The combined thermal output of the livestock end of a Norse longhouse was, in the depths of January, a genuine contribution to the survival of the humans at the other end. The smell, which you are managing through a combination of adaptation and focused breathing, is the price of this arrangement, and by Norse standards it was a price that required no particular justification. Cold was the enemy. Warmth was the resource. The animals provided warmth. The accounting was simple. The social architecture of the longhouse is less simple, and it is something you are going to need to understand quickly, because almost everything that happens in this building over the course of a winter day is shaped by it. Norse society in the Viking Age was hierarchical in ways that were formal, understood, and enforced not primarily through written law in most daily contexts, but through the lived, ambient pressure of social expectation and collective memory. At the top of the household hierarchy is the householder, the carl, the free farmer, the man whose name the farm carries, and his wife, the husfrige, whose authority over the interior of the longhouse is comprehensive and not to be casually tested. Below them are the free members of the household, family members, the grown children who have not yet established their own farms, the hired workers who have attached themselves to the household for the winter season in exchange for food and shelter and whatever wage the agreement specified. And then there are the thralls. This is the part of Norse social history that popular culture handles awkwardly, either by omitting it or by briefly acknowledging it and moving on, and it deserves a fuller accounting because it was not peripheral to Norse life. It was structural. Thralls, enslaved people, were a significant presence in Norse society throughout the Viking Age, acquired through raiding, through trade, through birth to enslaved mothers, and through the legal mechanisms that could reduce a free person to thrall status through debt or criminal penalty. Estimates of the proportion of thralls in Norse Age Scandinavian populations vary considerably and are difficult to calculate from the available evidence, but they were not rare, and their labor was woven into the functioning of Norse households and farms at every level. Historians still argue whether the scale of Norse slave-taking and slave-trading has been adequately reckoned with in the popular understanding of Viking culture, with some researchers arguing that the raiding economy cannot be understood without placing the acquisition and sale of enslaved people at its center rather than its margins. In the longhouse this morning, the thralls are among the first to be assigned the hardest and coldest work. This is not a coincidence. The hierarchy of labor in a Norse household mapped closely onto the hierarchy of status, and the distribution of the most physically punishing tasks reflects this with a clarity that requires no interpretation. You notice this, you file it away. The Norse world is not a simple place, and its complexity is not always comfortable to sit with. The spatial management of all these people, free and unfree, adults and children, the elderly and the able-bodied, within the longhouse is governed by rules that are partly explicit and partly absorbed through growing up in this environment. Where you sit matters. Where you sleep matters. Where you sit at the evening meal, which we will get to in due course, matters considerably. The high seat, the unvergisular, the carved and decorated seat at the center of the long wall, belongs to the householder, and its symbolic importance is so significant that when Norse settlers moved to new lands, they sometimes threw the carved pillars of their high seat into the sea before landing and built their new farm wherever the pillars washed ashore, letting the seat itself choose the location of the homestead. That is how much the high seat meant. It was not furniture. It was identity made physical. For now, the high seat is empty, the householder is outside or occupied elsewhere, and the longhouse is operating on the momentum of its daily routine, which ticks forward with the reliability of a system that has been running long enough to have internalized all of its own rules. Children are doing children's work, which in a Norse household means real work scaled to their size and ability. Not because childhood was not recognized as a distinct phase of life, but because the household needed every pair of hands, and the concept of childhood as a protected space free from productive labor was not a cultural value that the Norse operating system had installed. A child of 8 or 9 in this household is carrying, fetching, tending the younger children, feeding the animals, running small errands that an adult is too occupied to manage. The child does this without complaint that you can detect, which may reflect genuine acceptance or may reflect the fact that complaining has not historically produced useful results in this environment. The weaving is happening. This is one of the defining sounds and activities of a Norse longhouse in winter, and it deserves more than a passing mention because it represents something extraordinary about how this culture managed the long, dark, indoor hours of the cold season. The vertical warp-weighted loom, a technology that predates the Viking Age by millennia and remained the primary weaving apparatus in Scandinavia through this period, stands against the wall, and on it a length of wool fabric is growing, row by row, with a slow and meditative rhythm that is the oral equivalent of watching snowfall. The weights hanging from the warp threads, typically rings or oblongs of fired clay, sometimes stone, click softly against each other with each pass of the weft thread, a sound so consistent and so woven into the daily soundscape of the longhouse that it would be more notable by its absence. The woman working the loom, and loom work in Norse culture was gendered strongly toward women, though not exclusively, is working with a focused efficiency that does not look like it is trying to be efficient. It simply is. She has been doing this long enough that the movements are muscle memory, leaving her mind available for other things, for conversation, for listening to the household around her, for whatever interior life she is living that the historical record will never fully capture. The fabric she is producing will become clothing, or sales, or trade goods, possibly all three at different scales and in different household seasons. The loom does not stop for winter. Winter is, in fact, when the loom is most active, because winter is when the outdoor work that occupies summer is impossible and the long dark hours need to be filled with something productive and warm. The smell of the longhouse in the late morning is a layered composition that you are slowly, reluctantly learning to read. Wood smoke is the base note, constant, foundational, present in everything. Above it, the animal smell from the far end of the building, which is not exactly pleasant but is warm-scented in a way that cold-scented is not, and which you are genuinely beginning to associate with security rather than discomfort, which is perhaps the most Norse psychological adaptation you have made so far. There is the smell of food preparation beginning. We will get to the evening meal in good time, and the smell of wet wool drying near the fire from this morning's outdoor excursions, and underneath all of it something older and more fundamental, the smell of many human lives in close quarters, of breath and skin and effort, the smell of a community that has been sheltering together long enough to have become a single atmospheric system. The intimacy of this arrangement is, depending on your perspective, either deeply comforting or mildly suffocating, and there is evidence in the Norse sagas and in the broader corpus of Norse literature that both responses were available to people living it. The sagas are full of people who step outside, or who go on long journeys, or who find reasons to be away from the household, and the desire for space and solitude is present in Norse culture even as the social and survival imperatives of the long winter push consistently in the opposite direction. You cannot afford, practically or socially, to be too much of a loner in a Norse winter. The household needs you. The household is also sometimes a great deal, and the thin partition between the need for community and the need for a moment alone is one of the more quietly universal features of the Viking Age domestic world. The longhouse is also a space of significant noise, which surprises people who have not thought carefully about it. The popular image of the Viking longhouse tends toward the dramatic, the feast, the skald's performance, the firelit storytelling, and those things are real and we will get to them. But the daytime soundscape is less cinematic and more functional, the click of the loom weights, the low conversation of people working together, the occasional sharp exchange between someone who wants something done differently and someone who disagrees, the sound of a child being corrected, the fire's variable crackling as the wood catches and settles, the animals shifting and vocalizing at the far end, and underneath it all the wind, which is always audible through the walls and the smoke hole and the imperfect ceiling of the doorway, reminding everyone inside what waits outside, and why inside, for all its density and smoke and complexity, is the better option. There is a dog. There is almost certainly a dog. Dogs in the Norse world were working animals and companions in roughly equal measure, kept for hunting, herding, and the kind of general alert sounding that a farm in a period without fences and locks relies on. The dog is currently lying as close to the fire as it has been allowed to get, which is not quite as close as it would prefer, and it is watching the room with the alert, calculating gaze of an animal that knows exactly where the food comes from and has developed a sophisticated model of human behavior in the service of being nearby when relevant decisions are made. The dog knows you are new. It has already assessed you. Its conclusion is currently pending further data. The longhouse does not stop. This is the thing that takes the longest to fully absorb about Norse winter domestic life. Its relentlessness. which is not the relentlessness of crisis but of steady, unbroken necessity. The fire needs tending every hour or so. The animals need feeding and watering. The weaving progresses. The food preparation cycles through its stages. The children are managed. The tools are maintained because a broken tool in winter, when the smith may or may not be available and the resources for repair are limited, is a problem that cascades quickly into inconvenience and potentially beyond. Everything is happening all the time, and everyone has a role in the everything, and the longhouse sustains this rhythm through the short gray day and into the long gray evening without any of the structural breaks that modern life provides. You find a place near the loom, slightly out of the way but clearly within the working area of the household, and you pick up the task that has been left near you with the quiet intentionality of a household that wastes nothing, including the labor of visitors. It is a pile of raw wool, uncombed and slightly matted, waiting for the card combs that will pull it into the long parallel fibers needed for spinning. You pick up the combs. You look at the wool. You look at the woman at the loom, who has not looked at you but whose posture communicates that she is aware of everything happening in her immediate vicinity. You begin to card. You are bad at it. You improve slowly, which is the Norse method for most things. You do the work until the work teaches you how to do the work, and the winter is long enough for the lesson to take. The smoke drifts. The weights click. Outside, the brief light is moving toward its brief zenith, and the household moves with it, and you move with the household, and the longhouse holds all of it, the warmth and the smell and the noise and the hierarchy and the intimacy and the dog's patient, calculating eyes in its smoke-dark interior, doing what it has been built to do, keeping everyone alive until spring. Someone hands you an axe. Not dramatically, not with ceremony or instruction or even eye contact. It simply appears in your peripheral vision, handle first, held out by a forearm that belongs to one of the farmhands who has been moving through the longhouse this morning with the focused efficiency of a person who has a mental list of tasks and is working through it with grim, methodical pleasure. The axe is medium weight, single bit, its head dark with use and its handle worn smooth at the grip in a way that speaks to years of the same hands doing the same work. It is not a weapon. It is a tool. The distinction matters enormously in this context, though the Norse relationship between tool and weapon was always somewhat fluid, because a culture that needed axes for firewood and occasionally needed them for other things did not see the point in maintaining two entirely separate categories. You take the axe. You follow the farmhand outside. The woodpile is around the side of the longhouse, partially sheltered by a low outbuilding that also contains the stored peat and the spare tools and, currently, a quantity of frozen mud that has achieved the structural integrity of concrete and is not going anywhere until May. The woodpile is large. It needs to be large because a Norse longhouse burns through fuel at a rate that is both necessary and sobering when you think about how that wood got here. Every log in this pile was once a tree, somewhere on this landscape, that was identified, felled, sectioned, transported, and stacked, and the labor involved in that sequence is one of the defining background conditions of Norse winter life. Wood is not unlimited. The forests of coastal Norway and Iceland were under significant pressure from Norse settlement and woodland management controlling how much was cut, from where, on what rotation, was a real and sometimes contentious issue in communities that depended on timber for building, fuel, and boat construction simultaneously. Historians still argue whether the deforestation of Iceland, which went from a landscape with meaningful woodland cover at the time of Norse settlement in the 9th century to the largely treeless terrain it presents today, was primarily the result of deliberate clearing for agriculture, unsustainable fuel consumption, grazing pressure from sheep, or some combination of all three accelerating each other in ways that no single actor planned or intended. What is not disputed is that within a few generations of Norse settlement in Iceland, would have become scarce enough that driftwood, timber carried by ocean currents from the forests of Siberia and North America, was a legally recognized and seriously contested resource, with laws governing who could claim it from the shore. You are chopping wood this morning with the automatic confidence of a household that still has enough of it, but the household did not arrive at having enough of it through accident. The chopping block is a section of a large trunk, set into the ground at a slight angle to give it stability, its top surface deeply scarred from years of use. You set a log upright on it, raise the axe, and bring it down. The log splits cleanly, good, dry wood, properly seasoned, doing what it is supposed to do, and the two halves fall to either side with a sound that is enormously satisfying in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it but is probably related to some deep, pre-verbal part of the human brain that associates that particular crack with warmth and security and the completion of something necessary. You split the halves again. You stack the quarters against the longhouse wall. You set another log on the block. The cold, which you braced against when you came outside, has settled into a steady presence rather than a shock. Your body, working now, is generating heat from the inside. The axe work is not gentle, it involves your whole upper body in a coordinated motion that quickly brings warmth to your arms and shoulders and back. And within 10 minutes you have opened your cloak slightly because the combination of physical effort and wool layers has created a microclimate inside your clothing that is almost briefly comfortable. This is one of the fundamental experiences of working in cold weather, the paradox of the exertion warmth, which feels wonderful and which must be managed carefully, because the moment you stop working that internally generated heat dissipates and you cool down faster than you warmed up, and the sweat that your effort has produced in your inner wool layers now becomes a liability. Damp wool against skin, cooling rapidly, conducting heat away from your body with an efficiency that the dead air insulation was specifically designed to prevent. You keep a mental note of this. When you stop chopping, you close your cloak again immediately. You have learned this from watching the farmhand, who does it automatically, without thought, the way you put on a seatbelt. A habit so thoroughly absorbed that the conscious mind is no longer involved. The woodpile is one task in a morning that contains more tasks than the morning has light for, and the sequencing of those tasks is a matter of practical knowledge that the Norse household has refined over generations. You do the outdoor tasks while daylight, such as it is, permits. You do the indoor tasks in the diminishing afternoon and into the fire-lit evening. The outdoor tasks are numerous, physically demanding, and non-negotiable. The animals need feeding. This means carrying fodder, dried hay stored in the outbuilding, rationed carefully from the autumn harvest, to the livestock end of the longhouse and distributing it in quantities that keep the animals healthy without depleting the supply ahead of schedule. The fodder calculation is its own ongoing anxiety. Norse farmers kept a careful mental accounting of how much hay remained against how many weeks of winter stood between today and the first new grass of spring. And a farm that ran out of fodder before the grass came up faced the prospect of losing livestock that represented not just this year's food supply but next year's breeding stock, next year's milk, next year's wool. A cascading loss with multi-year consequences. The water trough needs breaking. You have done this already this morning. But ice is persistent and diligent and has been rebuilding its claim on the trough surface since your first intervention. You break it again with the back of the axe, a different motion than chopping, a sharp, downward strike at the ice edge rather than a full swing, and the ice cracks and submerges, and the animals, who have been watching this process with the focused interest of creatures who know exactly what it means, crowd toward the trough with a relieved purposefulness that is briefly, genuinely heartwarming. There are fence repairs to consider. The fences and boundary markers of a Norse farm, the structures that defined property lines, kept animals in specific areas, and performed the important social function of making visible where one household's claim ended and another's began, were under constant pressure from winter conditions. Snow load breaks the tops of fence posts. Frost heave tilts them. The freeze-thaw cycle loosens the joints between horizontal rails and vertical supports until the whole structure needs to be walked and assessed and repaired section by section. A job that is never entirely finished because the conditions that damage it are never entirely finished. You do not tackle the full fence today. That would be several hours of cold work that the afternoon light will not support. But you note where the worst damage is and mentally prioritize it for the next clear day. The outbuildings need checking. Beyond the main longhouse, a Norse farmstead typically included several subsidiary structures, a separate storage building, a smithy if the household was prosperous enough to maintain one, a boat shed if the farm was coastal, animal shelters for the livestock that were not kept in the main longhouse. These buildings are the connective tissue of the farm's winter functioning, and each one requires a periodic circuit of assessment. Is the roof holding under snow load? Has anything been disturbed by animals or weather? Are the stores inside intact and dry? Are the tools in order? You do this circuit with the farmhand, moving from building to building in the thin, flat light of the late morning, and you learn the layout of this farmstead the way you learn any physical space, through the body, through repetition, through the accumulating proprioception of having been in a place long enough for it to become familiar. The smithy deserves a moment's pause, because even in winter, even in the cold, the smith's work does not entirely stop. The Norse blacksmith, the smur, held a status in the community that exceeded the merely practical. Iron tools were essential to almost every aspect of farm life, and the ability to make and repair them was a skill that commanded respect and some degree of social elevation. The smith made and mended the axe heads and the plowshares and the knives and the nails and the hinges and the hooks and the 100 small iron components that a functioning farm required. In winter, the smithy fire served double duty. It was a workspace and a heat source, and the smith's forge was one of the warmest indoor spaces on the farm, a fact that was not lost on anyone. A quirky but well-documented aspect of Norse blacksmithing tradition is the significant overlap between the smith's craft and the realm of the magical. The Norse god Odin was associated with wisdom and war, but also with the transformative arts, and the smith, who literally transformed raw material into useful objects through the application of fire and force, occupied a culturally liminal space between the craftsman and the sorcerer that made people simultaneously grateful for and slightly wary of very skilled smiths. Whether this wariness was ever expressed openly or remained a background hum of cultural association is, naturally, a matter of historical interpretation. Back at the woodpile, which you have now reduced and restacked in a more organized configuration than you found it, there is still more to do. Much more. Norse winter farm chores operated on a logic of never quite done, where completing one task revealed the next waiting behind it, and the waiting was never patient. Rope needs mending. The type of rope in use on a Norse farm was typically made from twisted plant fiber, hemp or nettle, or from animal hide, and it was under constant mechanical stress from the work it was asked to do. A worn section of rope replaced before it fails is a small piece of work. A rope that fails while in use, dropping a heavy load, releasing an animal at the wrong moment, failing on a boat, is a large problem that could be a crisis. You find a coil of rope with a fraying section and sit on the woodpile steps, finding the least cold surface available in the farmyard, which is a skill that develops quickly and naturally, and begin the repair with cold fingers and a patience you are actively manufacturing, because the cold does not encourage patience, but the work requires it. Tools need maintenance in ways that go beyond simple repair. Axe heads loosen on their handles as the wood of the handle contracts in the cold and the metal contracts at a different rate, and a loose axe head is a safety problem with serious implications when you are chopping wood alone in a farmyard with limited access to emergency medical care. You check the axe you were handed this morning, the head is tight, someone has already maintained it, and add that to your accumulating picture of this household as one that pays attention to its tools, which is a proxy for paying attention to everything that matters. There is something meditative about this work if you allow it to be. The Norse philosophers, and there were Norse philosophers in the sense of people who thought carefully and systematically about how to live, even if their philosophy came in the form of poetry and saga rather than formal treatise, had a concept that runs through the literature of the period and is most visible in the Havamal, the collection of wisdom verses attributed to Odin, which advises its reader on practical virtues with a directness that is sometimes startling and often quietly profound. One of those virtues is work. Not glamorous work, not heroic work, but the daily, steady, showing up kind of work that keeps the farm running and the fire burning and the household alive through the season. The Havamal does not romanticize this. It simply states it as the condition of a worthwhile life. You do the work because the work is what there is, and the work is what you are. You split another load of wood. You stack it. Your arms are beginning to register the morning's effort as a warm, deep ache that is not unpleasant, the particular satisfaction of muscles that have been used properly, for their intended purpose, in conditions that required something real from them. Your hands are cold despite the mittens and the motion, and you periodically press them together inside the mittens to share heat between fingers, a reflex you developed somewhere in the last hour without consciously deciding to. The farmhand has moved on to the next task, which involves the fence after all, a section you had assessed as priority high and have now apparently been upgraded to priority immediate, because one of the animals got close enough to it this morning to demonstrate that it was less structural than hoped. You follow. You hold the post while he drives it back into the half-frozen ground with a wooden mallet, and the shock of each blow travels up through the post and into your hands and arms in a way that is uncomfortable but efficient, and the post is back in position within 10 minutes, and the rail is reset. And the fence does the thing that fences exist to do. The light, which peaked around midday at an angle so low it barely cleared the tree-line to the south, is already beginning to retreat. You have been outside for what feels like a long time and has been, by the sun's accounting, approximately 4 hours, but 4 hours of physical labor in sustained cold has a different weight than 4 hours of indoor activity, and your body knows it. The cold has worked its way into your bones in the specific way it does when you have been outdoors long enough for the initial adjustment to wear off and the sustained extraction of heat to begin its slower, more insidious work. Your feet are the first report, not numb exactly, but communicating with a certain urgency. Your face has stopped registering temperature as a sensation and begun registering it as a condition, which is the cold's way of telling you that inside is now a biological necessity rather than a comfort preference. The farmhand seems untroubled by this. He moves at the same steady pace he has maintained all morning, his movements economical and unhurried, his face bearing the particular expression of someone who has long since made peace with discomfort as a permanent feature of the landscape. He is not enjoying the cold. He is simply not allowing it to be relevant to the rate at which he works, and this distinction between the feeling of cold and the decision about what to do with that feeling is perhaps the most Norse thing you have witnessed today. You carry the last armload of split wood to the stack by the longhouse wall. You stomp your feet once, twice, 3 times, partly to dislodge the snow from your shoes and partly because your feet require the reminder that they still exist. The door to the longhouse is ahead of you, its frame leaking a thin ribbon of warm, smoky air that at this moment smells like the most welcoming thing in the world. Beyond that door is the fire, and the smell of food beginning to be prepared for the evening, and the sound of the loom, and the dog's calculating eyes, and all the layered complexity of a household that is doing everything it needs to do to survive until tomorrow. You have done a morning's work. You have done the kind of work that requires nothing from you except your body and your willingness to keep applying it to what needs doing, and the requirement was modest in terms of skill but not in terms of stamina or cold tolerance or the quiet, stubborn refusal to let discomfort become an excuse. You have not done this as well as anyone who grew up doing it. You have done it adequately, which is the Norse standard for a first day, and possibly the Norse standard for most days, because adequate and sustained beats excellent and intermittent every single winter. You go inside. The warmth wraps around you like something earned. The journey is not your idea. It becomes necessary in the way that unwanted things often become necessary in a Norse winter. Not through drama or sudden crisis, but through the quiet accumulation of practical reality pressing against the household's resources until someone has to go somewhere and get something, and you are available, and available is the primary qualification required. What is needed is specific and non-negotiable, a tool that the smith at the neighboring farm has repaired and is holding for collection, a tool whose absence has been creating a workaround in the daily operations of this household for the past week. A workaround that everyone has been managing with the stoic creativity of people who are good at managing but who would rather just have the tool back. The neighboring farm is perhaps 4 kilometers away. This is, by the standards of a summer afternoon, a casual walk. By the standards of a January afternoon in a Norse winter landscape, it is an exercise in judgment, preparation, and the kind of focused attention to environmental conditions that the difference between arriving safely and not arriving safely depends on entirely. You are going with the farmhand. This is not negotiable either, and you understand why without being told. The Norse did not send people on winter journeys alone if they had any choice in the matter, and this had nothing to do with social preference and everything to do with the mathematics of cold weather survival. A person alone who twists an ankle on hidden ice, or breaks through thin ice over a stream, or loses their bearing in a sudden whiteout squall, has no options. A person with a companion has options. The companion is not luxury. The companion is the safety system. You spend a few minutes before leaving doing something you would not have thought to do this morning, before the day taught you what it has taught you so far. You assess the sky. You do this standing in the farmyard, looking south and then west, reading the clouds, or rather, watching the farmhand read the clouds and inferring from his expression and the slight adjustments he makes to his assessment of what you are seeing above you. The sky to the west, which is the direction from which weather arrives on this coast, is a uniform gray that has been uniform gray all day and gives nothing obvious away. But there is a quality to it, a slight darkening at the lower edge, a change in the texture of the cloud layer from flat to faintly layered, that the farmhand reads as stable for the next few hours, probably with a reservation about the word, probably that his expression communicates clearly. You have perhaps 3 hours of usable light remaining. The journey to the neighboring farm and back is 2 hours in good conditions. The margin is acceptable. It is not comfortable. The route you take is not a road in any modern sense. There are paths, worn tracks in the landscape that are the accumulated result of many previous journeys in the same direction. Paths that in summer are easily visible and in winter are present as slight variations in the depth and texture of the snow. Legible to someone who knows what they are looking at and invisible to someone who does not. The farmhand knows what he is looking at. You stay close to him, not so close as to be in his way, but close enough that if the landscape became suddenly ambiguous you could navigate by his certainty rather than your own absence of it. The landscape you are moving through is extraordinary in a way that the practical demands of moving through it make it difficult to fully appreciate. Snow covers everything: the ground, the rocks, the low scrub vegetation, the frozen edges of the streams you cross on stepping stones that require careful placement of each foot. The trees, where there are trees, carry snow on their branches in accumulations that occasionally release without warning, dropping sudden small avalanches at random intervals, which is only startling the first 2 or 3 times. The fjord, visible to your left as you crest a low rise, is a study in gray and white, the water at its center a dark, slow-moving gray, its edges locked in shelf ice that extends perhaps 10 meters from shore, the ice surface dusted with fresh snow so that the boundary between solid and liquid is visible only as a subtle change in the surface texture. The fjord is not frozen solid. At this time of year, at this latitude, the main body of the fjord keeps moving, keeps its liquid state through the combination of salt content and the tidal exchange that runs back and forth with the mechanical indifference of the sea. But the edges are not safe, and the farmhand steers you away from them without discussion, taking a line slightly higher on the hillside that maintains distance from the ice margin. Ice is the primary physical hazard of winter travel in the Norse landscape, and its various forms require different responses that the Norse classified with a practical vocabulary that modern languages have mostly not needed to preserve. There is the ice on still water, ponds, lake margins, backwaters, which forms from the top down and whose thickness can sometimes be assessed by its color and opacity, clear blue-black ice being stronger than white opaque ice, though neither should be trusted without testing. There is the ice on moving water, stream crossings, river edges, which is structurally less reliable than still water ice because the current continues its work underneath, thinning the ice from below in ways that are not visible from the surface, creating bridges of ice that look solid and are not. There is verglas, the thin, transparent glaze of ice that forms on rock surfaces and path surfaces when rain or meltwater freezes on contact, essentially invisible against the underlying material and exactly as slippery as it sounds. And there is snow-bridged ice, the most dangerous variety, where a thin layer of ice over water or a void is covered by snow that gives it the visual appearance of solid ground, making it indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape until the moment you step on it and it is not there. The farmhand tests each crossing with a long wooden staff that he has brought along and that you did not fully appreciate the purpose of when he picked it up. You appreciate it now. He prods the ice ahead of each step at stream crossings, assessing the resistance, reading the sound. A clear ring suggests solid ice. A dull thud or a creak suggests something less reliable, before committing his weight. You follow his footsteps exactly, placing your feet where he has placed his, because his route across each crossing has been tested and yours has not, and this is not the morning for independent decision-making about ice. The cold on this exposed hillside is different from the cold in the farmyard. The farmyard was sheltered by the longhouse walls, by the outbuildings, by the shape of the land around it that the farm had been positioned to take advantage of. Out here, the wind finds you with a directness that your cloak is managing but not eliminating. The wind at this temperature, at this speed, not a gale, a steady moderate wind, the kind of wind that does not make drama but simply works, drives the cold into any exposed surface with a patient, thorough efficiency. Your face, particularly your cheeks and the bridge of your nose, is receiving the full communication. You pull your cloak higher, covering your mouth and nose, and breathe through the wool, which warms the air slightly before it reaches your lungs, and also gives everything you breathe the distinctive flavor of lanolin and campfire. There is a kind of stripped-down clarity to moving through a winter landscape under these conditions that is, when you can access it past the physical discomfort, genuinely remarkable. The world in January at this latitude is reduced to its essentials: sky, snow, rock, water, cold, wind, in a way that removes all the visual complexity that other seasons provide and leaves you with a landscape that is both vast and spare, a kind of negative space that the Norse filled, culturally and psychologically, with a rich interior life of myth and meaning. The land was not empty to them. It was populated by landvetter, the land spirits that inhabited specific features of the landscape and required acknowledgement and respect, by the memories of people who had traveled these routes before, by the accumulated names that the Norse gave to every significant feature of their physical world, names that encoded information about terrain and history and navigational relevance. The Norse relationship with their physical landscape was intimate in a way that is difficult for modern people accustomed to mediated, managed environments to fully reconstruct. They named the rocks. They named the particular fjord bends. They named the currents and the wind directions and the cloud formations with a specificity that was not poetic ornamentation but practical information management, a way of encoding navigational and meteorological knowledge in language that could be transmitted orally and retrieved under the kind of stressful, cold, time-pressured conditions that required immediate access to what you knew. When the farmhand glances at the western sky and makes a slight adjustment to his pace, he is not performing a casual weather check. He is running a sophisticated pattern recognition process built on years of accumulated observation, cross-referenced with oral knowledge passed down from the people who walked this route before him, producing a practical output in real time. This is what environmental knowledge looks like before there are instruments to externalize it. The neighboring farm appears after about 40 minutes of walking, first as a thin thread of smoke above the treeline, then as the dark shapes of outbuildings against the white hillside, then as a longhouse not so different from the one you left this morning, settled into its landscape with the same low, practical profile, the same smoke rising from the same roof opening, the same geometry of shelter and warmth that a building in this climate converges toward regardless of the specific choices of its builders. The reception at the neighboring farm is warm in the Norse sense of warm, which is functional and genuine without being effusive. You are brought inside, ducking through the same low doorway, entering the same smoky interior, feeling the same shift of temperature and atmosphere that marks the threshold between outside and in. You are offered something to drink, which is important, because the offering and acceptance of hospitality in Norse culture was not mere politeness. To accept it with appropriate gratitude was to participate in a system of reciprocal obligation that bound Norse communities together across the distances of the winter landscape. The drink is a warm liquid, possibly a weak ale, possibly an herbal infusion of some kind, possibly something that the modern palate would struggle to categorize but that the cold emptied interior of your body receives as an act of rescue. You hold the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth travel up through your palms and into your fingers, which are stiff enough that the cup requires a slightly more deliberate grip than it would on a summer afternoon. The farmhand and the neighbor are talking, a Norse conversation of practical content and efficient form, covering the tool, the repair, the state of the paths, the weather assessment, a brief exchange of information about conditions at each farm that is simultaneously social and logistical. The Norse version of the morning briefing. The tool is produced, a repaired iron implement whose specific function you have gathered from context but whose name in Old Norse remains outside your vocabulary. It is wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth and placed in the farmhand's pack with a care that reflects both its value and the conditions it will travel through. The repair has been done well. The neighbor takes a justifiable satisfaction in this that is visible without being ostentatious, the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work is recognized by the person it was done for. You are back outside within 20 minutes. The sky to the west has developed the slight layering you both noticed earlier, more pronounced now, the lower edge of the cloud bank darker than it was. The farmhand's assessment of this is delivered in a look, a specific, brief, directed look at the sky, then at you, then at the path home, that communicates the need to move with some purpose without tipping into alarm. You move. The return journey is slightly faster than the outward one, not from carelessness but from the body's knowledge of the route now, the tested crossings, the reliable footing, the landmarks that have been registered and filed. The wind has picked up marginally, which is the sky's way of confirming the farmhand's reading of it, and the cold on your exposed face has sharpened from steady presence to pointed commentary. The light is failing in the particular way of a Norse winter afternoon, not dramatically, not in the sudden theatrical drop of a tropical sunset, but in a slow, gray draining, the ambient light reducing by degrees, the shadows lengthening and then losing their definition and then disappearing into a general dimness that is the prelude to dark. You cross the last stream crossing 15 minutes from home. The ice at its edge has expanded since morning, the temperature dropping as the afternoon proceeds, the water's edge freezing further inward, and the farmhand takes a slightly different line than on the way out, reading the changed conditions with the same quiet attention he has applied to everything today. You follow. The ice holds. The farmyard, when you see it, has the quality of a destination that you have not taken for granted. The longhouse crouches in the gray-white landscape with its thread of smoke and its domestic sounds, its light leaking around the door frame in a warm, narrow strip that is the most welcoming thing in this landscape, and you understand, in your body, in the part of your understanding that is not intellectual but physical and immediate, why the Norse invested the hearth with spiritual significance, why the fire was not just a fire but a presence, why coming home was not a neutral event but an arrival at something that mattered. The farmhand pulls the door open. The warmth comes out to meet you. You duck inside and the cold, which has had you for 2 hours, releases its claim, reluctantly, partially, with the clear implication that it will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the season turns. For now, you are inside. For now, the fire is going. For now, that is everything that needs to be true. The dark arrives the way it always arrives in a Norse January, not as an event but as a condition, settling over the landscape with the patient completeness of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has no particular interest in your feelings about it. Inside the longhouse, the transition from afternoon to evening is marked not by any single moment but by a gradual shift in the quality of activity. The outdoor work has been called in by the failing light, the household has contracted inward toward the fire, and the tasks that were being done in the thin daylight are replaced by tasks that can be done by firelight, which is a different category of task and a different quality of attention. The fire has been built up for the evening, fed with the wood you split this morning, and it is burning with a generosity that the careful daytime management has been building toward, higher flames, more light, more warmth radiating outward into the room in a way that pushes the darkness back toward the walls but does not eliminate it. The corners of the longhouse are dim. The ceiling overhead is dark. The fire is the world, in the practical sense that it is where the light is and where the warmth is and where the household has gathered, and everything beyond its reach is defined by its absence. This is the hour, the long dark evening that stretches from the last of the daylight to the sleep that eventually claims the household, that the Norse filled with a cultural richness that stands in deliberate, almost defiant contrast to the physical conditions outside. It is easy, from the outside, to look at the material hardship of Norse winter life and imagine the evenings as simply an extension of the hardship. Exhausted people sitting in silence, enduring the dark. The reality was something different and considerably more interesting, and it matters to understand it because it represents one of the central achievements of Norse culture, the transformation of the longest, darkest, coldest hours of the year into the primary space for the transmission of knowledge, identity, and meaning. The Norse spiritual world is not easily summarized, and it is not easily separated from the practical world, because the Norse did not draw the boundary between spiritual and practical where modern Western thought tends to draw it. The gods were not remote. They were not primarily concerned with abstract moral instruction or with the management of an afterlife that was the main event. They were, in the Norse conception, actively involved in the world, sometimes helpful, sometimes dangerous, sometimes simply present in the way that weather is present, powerful and directional, and not particularly interested in your convenience. Odin, the All-Father, was a figure of wisdom and war and poetry and death and magic, a god who had sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of knowledge and who hung on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days in a self-imposed ordeal to learn the runes, not as a metaphor, but as a literal account of what wisdom costs. Thor was the thunder, the protector of humanity against the chaos of the giants, beloved and accessible in a way that Odin was not, a god you prayed to for good weather and safe passage and the basic operational functioning of the world. Freyr and Freya governed fertility and love and the productive abundance that winter threatened and spring restored, and their particular relevance to this season, the season of scarcity and darkness, when the Earth's capacity to produce seemed maximally in doubt, was not abstract but immediate. The Norse cosmos was structured around Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree whose roots and branches connected the nine worlds. Asgard, the realm of the gods; Midgard, the world of humans; Jotunheim, the realm of the giants; and the others, each distinct and each in a relationship of tension and negotiation with the others. This was not a universe built on the triumph of order over chaos. It was built on the management of the relationship between them, a relationship that was permanent and dynamic and that the gods themselves were not immune to. The Norse mythological cycle was moving toward Ragnarok, the great battle at the end of the age in which the gods themselves would fall, and this foreknowledge was not a theological problem to be resolved but a feature of the worldview, an acknowledgement that even divine power was subject to time and consequence. The Norse gods were mortal in the ultimate sense, and this shared mortality with the humans who worshipped them gave the relationship a particular quality. Less the supplication of the infinitely lesser to the infinitely greater, more the solidarity of beings who were all, in the end, subject to the cold and the dark and the turning of the age. You are sitting by the fire now, in the company of the household, and the fire is doing what fire does in an enclosed space on a January night. It is making the world smaller and warmer and more itself, drawing people together around its light in the configuration that human beings have been arranging themselves in around fires for as long as there have been human beings and fires. The oldest member of the household, a man whose age you cannot precisely determine but who carries it in the deep lines of his face and the deliberate economy of his movements, is seated in the position closest to the high seat, which is either a concession to his seniority or simply a reflection of the fact that he got to the best spot first, and you are not entirely sure which. He is going to tell a story. You know this before he begins because the room has made a subtle adjustment. A quieting, an orientation, the kind of collective attention that precedes a story in any culture, the social signal that says, now is the time for the thing that holds us together. The children have stopped their movement. The weaving continues, it almost always continues, because the hands can work while the ears listen, and the Norse were not in the habit of letting productivity lapse for entertainment. But the rhythm of it has slowed slightly, the loom weights clicking at longer intervals, the woman working it giving more of her attention to the room. The story is a Norse story, told in the Norse way, which means it is not gentle and it is not simple and it is not primarily concerned with your comfort as a listener. It begins in the middle, with the assumption that you know the world it is set in and the figures who move through it, with the confidence of a storytelling tradition that has been building its audience's shared knowledge for generations and therefore does not need to explain itself. You catch fragments, the name Odin, the word for winter, a word you think means journey or road, a phrase whose rhythm suggests it is a kenning, one of the elaborate compound metaphors that Norse poetry specialized in, where the sea is the whale road and gold is the fire of the river and a sword is the wound snake. The kennings are one of the great pleasures of Norse literary culture and one of its most technically sophisticated features, a system of compressed metaphor that rewarded audiences with the depth of their cultural knowledge and could pack enormous amounts of associative meaning into a small number of syllables. The voice of the storyteller is not theatrical in the modern sense. It is not performed so much as inhabited, a quality of presence rather than presentation, the story delivered with a directness and economy that trusts the content to do its work without elaborate staging. The fire shifts. A log settles. The oldest child, who has been sitting with her knees pulled up and her eyes very wide, lets out a breath at something that happens in the narrative that clearly surprised her, and the old man pauses for exactly the right amount of time before continuing, a timing so precise it could only come from having told this story many times before to audiences whose reactions he knows as well as the story itself. This is how knowledge traveled in the Norse world. This is how it was stored and transmitted and kept alive across generations in a culture that was not primarily written, or rather, that had writing in the form of runes, the angular alphabet suited to carving on stone and wood and bone, but that used writing primarily for specific formal, commemorative purposes rather than for the continuous storage of narrative and knowledge that writing performs in literate cultures. The oral tradition was not a lesser substitute for writing. It was a complete and sophisticated system in its own right, with its own mnemonic techniques, its own quality control mechanisms, its own relationship between performer and audience that guaranteed a level of accuracy and preservation that people raised on the permanence of written text tend to underestimate. Historians still argue whether the Norse oral tradition was as stable and accurate across generations as its proponents claim, or whether the variation and drift that inevitably affect oral transmission introduced changes significant enough to make the recorded versions of the myths and sagas, written down mostly in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, well after the Viking Age proper, unreliable guides to what people in the 9th and 10th centuries actually believed. The debate is not resolved, and may not be resolvable with the evidence available, but it points to something genuinely important about the nature of cultural memory and the mechanisms by which a people hold on to who they are across time and catastrophe. The story ends. There is no applause. Applause is not the Norse response to a good story. There is a quality of silence that is its own form of appreciation, a shared fullness in the room that the good story has produced, and then the ordinary sounds of the evening resume, the fire, the loom, the low conversation that picks up again at the hearth's edge, carrying its freight of daily information and social maintenance and the small, continuous adjustments that people make when they are living very close together and need to keep the relationships functional. The spiritual practices of the Norse household were not confined to storytelling, though storytelling was one of the primary vehicles through which the spiritual world was made present and real. There were rituals, small, daily rituals whose form and frequency we only partially know, because the primary sources for Norse religious practice are either the literary texts written down after Christianization or the archaeological evidence of physical objects and structures, and both of these sources have significant gaps and interpretive complications. What we know is that the household had its own religious life, distinct from the large public rituals, the blot, the seasonal sacrificial feasts that brought the wider community together. There were household gods and protective spirits. There were small carved figures, the kinds of objects that archaeologists classify as idols or votive items, that were treated with the respect appropriate to beings with power over the household's welfare. There were words said before certain activities. There were things you did not do and times you did not travel and directions you did not face and objects you did not touch, because the world was full of significance and significance was full of consequence. The concept of seer, a form of Norse magic that involved the manipulation of fate, the reading of futures, the working of changes in the world through a specific kind of ritualized practice, was real and important and complicated in its social meaning. Seer was primarily associated with women, and with Freya as its divine originator, and it occupied a position in Norse culture that was simultaneously respected and suspect. It was powerful and useful and also somehow transgressive, associated with a kind of flexibility of identity and perspective that the Norse gender norms of the period found unsettling. Odin practiced seer, and this practice was explicitly noted in the sources as something that required explanation and even justification, because the power it represented came with a social cost that even a god was not entirely exempt from. The Volva, the female seer who traveled between communities, reading fates and offering prophecies in exchange for hospitality and payment, was a figure of considerable cultural importance whose ambiguous social position reflected the Norse ambivalence about the kind of knowledge she carried. None of this is abstract to the people in this longhouse on this January evening. The world these stories describe is the world they live in. The gods are not historical figures or metaphorical constructs. They are the actual governing forces of the actual universe, present and active and requiring management. The winter darkness through which you have been moving today is not just a meteorological condition. It is a phase of the cosmic cycle, the long exhale of the world between the warmth of summer and the return of the light, a period that has its own spiritual character and its own ritual requirements and its own particular relationship with the beings that move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The Norse conception of death is, by modern Western standards, remarkably unanxious about the finality of dying. There were multiple afterlife destinations available: Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors chosen by the Valkyries feasted with Odin in preparation for Ragnarok; Folkvanger, Freya's realm, which received another share of the dead; Hel, the realm of those who died of illness or old age or any of the undramatic causes that do not qualify a person for the more glamorous destinations, a place that was gray and quiet but not the punitive hell of Christian theology. There was also the possibility of continuing to exist in the burial mound, near the land and the family you had lived among, a local presence rather than a departed one. And there was reincarnation within the family line, the practice of naming children after recently deceased relatives, which carried the implication that something of the dead person was being reborn in the new child, that death was a phase rather than a terminus. The relationship with the dead in Norse culture was active and ongoing. The dead were addressed. They were offered food and drink at certain times of year. Their burial mounds were landmarks on the living landscape, visible daily, present in the topography of the known world rather than removed to a separate sacred space. This proximity was not morbid. It was practical in the way that Norse spirituality was consistently practical. The dead had been through the winter before, they knew this land, and maintaining a relationship with them was another form of the knowledge management that ran through every aspect of Norse life. You are watching the fire burn lower now, the household beginning to move towards sleep in the gradual, undeclared way of people who do not announce the end of the evening but simply find their way toward their sleeping places by natural degrees. The old man who told the story has been quiet since it ended, sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has discharged an important obligation and is now resting in the space it has made. The children are already asleep, arranged in their sleeping places with the total, immediate unconsciousness of the young and the genuinely tired. The loom has finally stopped, the only time in the waking day when it is silent, and the woman who worked it is winding the remaining yarn with movements so automatic they require no attention. The fire throws the last of its good light across the walls of the longhouse, illuminating for a moment the carved post of the high seat, a column of intertwined figures, animals and humans, the decorative grammar of a culture that thought in images as fluently as it thought in words. The carvings are not random. They are a text, encoding the values and the stories and the identity of the household in a form that will outlast the people who commissioned them, carrying something forward through time in the way that all human artifacts carry something forward, imperfectly, partially, but genuinely, the residue of a life pressed into the material world. Outside, the dark is complete. The temperature has dropped further with the clear night sky, the cold intensifying in the absence of cloud cover, the stars, where they are visible, burning with the particular sharpness that extreme cold and dry air produce, each one a hard point of light in a black that is deeper than anything your eyes encounter in a world with artificial lighting. The Norse navigated by those stars, read them, named them, built a sky map in their minds that connected the heavens to the horizon to the landscape below in a continuous system of orientation. Even the winter darkness was, in this sense, not a void but an environment, readable, meaningful, navigable by those who had learned its language. The longhouse holds its warmth. The fire breathes its last good heat into the room. The smoke drifts upward through the hole in the roof, carrying the day's residue. The wood smoke and the food smell and the animal warmth and the breath of everyone who has been alive in this space today, out into the cold dark where it disperses and vanishes, taking nothing essential with it. The stories are done for tonight. The gods are where they are. The dead are where they are. The living are here, in the warmth, in the dark, at the hinge of a night that is long and cold and entirely survivable, because it has been survived before, and the knowledge of how to survive it is alive in this room, in these people, in the fire's careful management and the food's careful rationing and the stories that carry everything forward from one dark season to the next. You pull your sleeping hides closer. The old man by the hearth has closed his eyes. The dog is a warm, breathing shape at the fire's edge, dreaming, perhaps, of summer. The night settles in, deep and cold and patient, and the longhouse holds. The evening meal is not what you expected. This is a pattern you have noticed accumulating throughout the day. The gap between what you expected and what you found, a gap that runs consistently in the same direction, toward something more complex and more human and more frankly difficult than the popular version of Viking life tends to suggest. The mead hall of the popular imagination is a specific and vivid picture. Long tables groaning with roasted meat, horned cups raised in thunderous toasts, warriors with impressive hair making enormous proclamations in firelight while a poet recites their deeds and a dog gnaws a bone in the foreground. It is a good picture. It has the advantage of being partially true. It has the disadvantage of being true in the way that a highlight reel is true. It captures the peak moments of a specific cultural performance and presents them as the general condition, leaving out the arithmetic of survival that governs everything else. The reality of the evening meal in a Norse winter household is simultaneously more modest and more meaningful than the highlight reel version. And understanding it requires understanding that the feast, the genuine feast, the blot feast, the celebration feast, the political and ceremonial feast, was a specific, intentional, resource-intensive event that happened at particular times for particular reasons, and was surrounded on all sides by the ordinary eating that was not a feast but was the thing that kept everyone alive between feasts. Tonight is not a feast night. Tonight is an ordinary winter evening, and the meal being prepared and served around the longhouse hearth is a meal of sufficiency and craft and careful management, not of abundance. The food has been in preparation since mid-afternoon, when the evening's cooking joined the longhouse's ongoing thermal economy, the fire being managed upward slightly, the iron pot over the hearth receiving the ingredients that have been assembled from the day's inventory. The primary dish is a stew, which is the Norse winter food in its most characteristic and most practical form. Stew is the cooking technology of the longhouse hearth because it requires one vessel, tolerates variation in its ingredients without structural failure, can be fed people in the sequence that the household's timing requires rather than all at once, and produces a warming, substantial meal from ingredients that individually might be insufficient but collectively become something genuinely nourishing. Into the pot have gone dried and rehydrated vegetables, turnips certainly, dried peas likely, possibly some onion from the stored autumn harvest, along with a portion of the smoked meat you noticed hanging from the rafters this morning, cut into pieces and added to the liquid early enough to soften and release their preserved flavor into the broth. The broth itself is water enriched over several hours of cooking into something complex and deeply savory, carrying the flavor of the meat and the smoke and the vegetables in a way that smells, from where you are sitting, genuinely excellent. It smells like warmth made liquid. It smells like the accumulated effort of a day being converted into something nourishing. And this smell is doing significant work on a body that has been outside in the cold for several hours today and is now sending increasingly emphatic messages about its caloric requirements. There is bread alongside. The dark, dense flatbread you encountered at breakfast, now slightly warmer from being placed near the fire for a few minutes, which improves it meaningfully. There may be some hard cheese, aged from the autumn's dairy production, cut into small pieces and distributed with a precision that reflects the rationing logic governing everything at this point in the winter. The cheese is sharp and dry and pairs with the stew in the way that sharp, dry things pair with rich, warm things, cutting through, providing contrast, making both things more themselves in relation to each other. The distribution of the food is managed by the husfrige, as almost everything in this interior space is managed by her, and the distribution is not random. Who gets how much, in what order, from which portion of the pot, these decisions encode the household's hierarchy in the most concrete possible terms, the serving order being a physical expression of social position that everyone present reads automatically and correctly. The householder is served first and best. The senior family members follow. The farmhands receive their portion from what remains after the family has been served, which is sufficient but calibrated differently. The thralls eat last and from what is left, a portion that is calculated to maintain their capacity for the next day's work, because a thrall who cannot work is a resource that has failed to justify its maintenance cost, and Norse household management was not sentimental about resources. You receive your bowl somewhere in the middle of the order, which places you in the social space of a guest of middling status, respected enough to be fed from the family portion, not senior enough to be served early. The bowl is wooden, wide and deep, and the stew that fills it is hot enough to steam in the air of the longhouse, which is warm but not warm enough to suppress steam entirely. You wrap your hands around it the way you wrapped them around the cup at the neighboring farm this afternoon. Palms flat against the warm wood, fingers spread, extracting every degree of warmth with an attentiveness that your hands, after today, consider entirely justified. You drink some of the broth directly from the bowl before using the spoon, because the broth is magnificent and also because the bowl is warm and you are not ready to give up that contact. The meal is eaten mostly in a companionable quiet broken by conversation that moves in the unhurried way of people who have been together all day and have no need to fill silence with noise. The Norse approach to mealtime conversation was, at least in the household context, less performative than the feast hall ideal suggests. The sagas are full of pointed, meaningful exchanges at formal meals, speeches and declarations, and the kind of dialogue that has been composed for effect, But the ordinary evening meal was something more domestic and more relaxed, a transition from the effort of the day toward the rest of the night, conducted in the familiar shorthand of people who know each other well enough to communicate efficiently. There is ale. There is almost certainly ale, because ale was the standard drink of the Norse household, produced on-site from malted barley or other available grain, fermented to a relatively low alcohol content that made it less a drink of intoxication than a drink of daily sustenance. The caloric contribution of ale in a diet that needed all the calories it could get was real and recognized, and the Norse brewed it as a household staple in the same category as bread, not as a luxury. The ale at the ordinary evening meal is not the strong, special mead of the feast mead, the honey-fermented drink that has become the dominant symbol of Norse drinking culture in the popular imagination, was expensive to produce and reserved for occasions that justified the cost. Ordinary ale did the daily work. You drink yours from a wooden cup and it is slightly sour, slightly flat by modern standards, but genuinely warming in the way that all carbohydrate-rich liquids are warming, and after today's outdoor hours it is exactly what your body was asking for. Now we need to talk about the mead hall itself, the concept, the reality, and the significant gap between them, because the mead hall is one of the organizing myths of the Viking Age popular imagination and it deserves an honest accounting. The Great Hall, the Scaly, the Drinking Hall, the Feast Hall was real. It existed at the centers of Norse political power, at the farms of jarls and kings and the great householders whose social and political authority required a physical space for its expression. The hall at Lidra in Denmark, the halls associated with Norwegian chieftains, the Great Hall at the Norse settlement of Lanseaux Meadows in Newfoundland. These were real structures, built large and furnished for exactly the kind of communal feasting that the popular image draws on. Spaces where political relationships were made and maintained through the ritualized exchange of food and drink and gifts and words. But the mead hall was the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of Norse people lived on farms whose physical scale was determined by agricultural practicality rather than political performance, in longhouses sized for household function rather than ceremonial display. They ate their winter meals around a domestic hearth, not a great hall fire. They drank their ale from household cups, not ceremonial drinking horns. The feast was a specific event to which people traveled from their ordinary lives, participated in the political and social work that feasting performed, and then returned to the domestic reality that the feast was an interlude within, not a summary of. The political work that feasting performed was, however, genuinely important, and understanding it changes how you think about the Norse social world. The feast was the primary mechanism through which the bonds of obligation and loyalty between a leader and his followers were created and renewed. The leader who feasted well, who provided abundantly, who gave gifts generously, who managed the ritual of the hall with the right combination of authority and accessibility, was the leader who maintained his position and his following. The leader who could not feast or who feasted badly, or who was seen to ration and withhold when abundance was expected, was a leader whose authority was visibly declining. This is why the economic management of the household's food stores was not merely a domestic concern but a political one. The ability to feast was an expression of power, and the winter's rationing was the invisible backstage management that made the public performance of generosity possible. Historians still argue whether the redistributive economy of the Norse feast hall, the leader receiving tribute and wealth from his followers and redistributing it through gifts and feasting, was primarily a system of economic efficiency, a form of political theater, or something more genuinely reciprocal and emotionally meaningful, a real expression of solidarity and mutual obligation that the participants experienced as such and not merely as performance. The answer is probably all three, in proportions that varied by context and by the individuals involved, and the fact that the question remains open is a reminder of how much of the Norse inner life is inaccessible to us from the outside. What the feast hall myth also tends to obscure is the extraordinary work involved in producing the food and drink that made the feast possible. The grain for the ale was grown, harvested, malted, and brewed. The meat was raised, fed, slaughtered, and preserved. The bread was milled and baked. The cheese was made and aged. The honey for the mead was harvested from bees whose management in the Norse climate was itself a skilled and labor-intensive activity. Every cup raised in the Great Hall, every platter carried to the high table, represented a chain of labor that extended back through the seasons to the fields and the livestock and the women at their brewing vessels and the men at their harvest. labor that was largely invisible in the feast itself but entirely constitutive of it. This is the connection between your evening meal tonight, modest, careful, genuinely nourishing, and the great hall feast that lives in the popular imagination. They are not different kinds of thing. They are the same project at different scales, the project of taking what the land produces, preserving it through the winter with skill and care, managing it through the cold months with the patient accounting of people who cannot afford to get the numbers wrong, and transforming it, at the right moment, into the social occasion that holds the community together and makes the hierarchy visible and renews the obligations that everyone depends on. The stew is finished. The bowl is set down. Around the hearth, the household is in the late evening configuration. The work slowing, the conversation quieting, the children already asleep and the adults moving by degrees toward the same destination. The fire has been managed back down to its overnight level, enough to hold the room against the cold, not enough to burn through the wood supply at a rate the household cannot sustain. The management of the fire overnight is its own skill, a careful calibration between the warmth that the sleeping household needs and the fuel that the sleeping household has, and the person responsible for this calibration does it with the routine competence of someone who has been doing it long enough that the calculation is automatic. The ale cup has been emptied and set aside. The dog has relocated from its fire-adjacent position to the sleeping area of the household's youngest child, where it has installed itself with the air of an animal performing a service warmth provision that it is aware will be tolerated because of its utility. The child, deeply asleep, does not register the arrival. The dog knows this and settles in with a satisfaction that is entirely visible. There is one more thing that the evening meal involved tonight that I have been holding back because it deserves its own moment, and the moment is now. Midway through the meal, the householder produced a small object from the storage chest near the high seat and placed it on the eating surface. A carved wooden figure, small enough to hold in one hand, worn smooth with handling, depicting a figure whose identity you recognized from the evening stories as one of the gods, though you cannot be certain which. He spoke a few words over it, not a long prayer, not an elaborate ritual, but a brief acknowledgement, a checking in, a here we are and here is what we have directed at something beyond the fire-lit room. Then he put it away and resumed eating. This is, in microcosm, what the Norse spiritual life looked like at the household level on an ordinary winter evening. Not the dramatic blot ritual with its animal sacrifice and its communal intensity. Not the Volva's trance journey through the hidden world. Just a man at his own hearth in the middle of winter, with his household fed and the fire managed and the day's work done. Taking a moment to acknowledge the forces that governed his world and making the small, daily gesture of relationship that his culture told him was necessary and appropriate and worth doing even on an ordinary night. Especially on an ordinary night, because the ordinary night in a Norse winter was the one that needed the most tending. The dramatic moments, the storms, the crises, the great decisions, those were the ones that drew the full ceremony, the full ritual attention. But the ordinary night, repeated 40, 50, 60 times between the last of the autumn and the first of the spring, was where the winter was actually survived. In the small, careful gestures. In the fire managed and the food rationed and the stories told and the gods briefly, practically acknowledged. In the accumulated weight of the ordinary, pressing steadily against the dark. You set your cup down. The household settles around you. The fire breathes. Outside, the cold holds everything in its patient, impartial grip, and inside the longhouse, the warmth holds back. For tonight, the warmth is winning. The night has deepened to its fullest dark by the time the household is completely still. Not the dark of a room with the lights off. Not the relative dark of a cloudy night in a world threaded through with the ambient glow of distant cities and lit roads and the blue pulse of screens behind curtains. This is the dark that existed before all of that, complete, structural, the dark that the Norse lived inside for the long months of winter as a simple condition of their latitude and their season, as unremarkable to them as electric light is to you and as absolute in its way. The smoke hole in the roof shows a small, irregular patch of sky in which, tonight, stars are visible, hard and bright and numerous in the way that stars are only visible from inside a world without light pollution. The Milky Way a genuine presence rather than the rumor it has become in most modern skies, a river of cold light running across the darkness overhead. You are not asleep yet. Everyone else, or nearly everyone, has found their way to sleep. The deep, immediate sleep of bodies that have worked hard in cold air and eaten a warm meal and are now releasing the day's effort into the darkness with the efficiency of people who cannot afford to lie awake with their thoughts when tomorrow's work begins at the same uncompromising hour. The farmhand is a still shape on his sleeping platform. The husfrija, whose management of today has been so continuous and so competent that her eventual sleep feels like a system's shutdown rather than a personal choice, is quiet. The children are arranged in their sleeping places with the boneless abandon of the genuinely exhausted young. Even the dog has stopped its small adjustments and settled into the slow breathing of deep sleep, its legs occasionally twitching in whatever dogs dream about, which in this case you suspect involves the fire and the food and the satisfied completion of its own daily obligations. You lie on your sleeping platform with your pile of hides arranged over you and you think about the day. This is perhaps the most modern thing you have done since arriving in this world, the reflective accounting of experience, the conscious processing of what has happened, and it sits slightly awkwardly in this environment, where the end of the day is simply the end of the day and not an occasion for journaling. But you are here, and you are awake, and the darkness is around you, and the thoughts come whether you invite them or not. You have been in a Norse winter for one day in which you woke in the dark, dressed in layers that your modern hands found complicated, ate food that your modern palate found challenging, worked outside in cold that your modern body found unambiguous, traveled across a winter landscape that your modern navigation instincts found genuinely concerning, sat through a darkness that your modern psychology found unexpectedly heavy, and arrived at this moment horizontal, warm, full, alive, with a different understanding of what all of those words mean than you had when you woke up. Alive in particular. Alive has a different weight tonight than it did this morning. Not because you were in serious danger, you were not, you were with people who knew exactly what they were doing, and the household systems, refined through generations of exactly this challenge, kept you safely within the margins of the survivable. But the margins were visible today in a way that they are not visible in a world where warmth is a thermostat setting and food is a refrigerator and light is a switch. You could see the edges. You could feel the distance between comfortable and not, between sufficient and insufficient, between the fire going and the fire going out. And that visibility changes something in your understanding of what a human life requires and what it costs and what the people who built this culture were doing when they built it. The Norse world was not a world of superhumans. This is perhaps the most important correction the day has offered to the popular imagination. The Norse were not people who were immune to cold or indifferent to hardship or constitutionally different from you in ways that made the winter manageable for them and unmanageable for you. They were people who had built, across generations of direct engagement with this specific environment, a comprehensive and sophisticated system for surviving it, in their clothing and their food preservation and their architecture and their social organization and their spiritual framework and their accumulated knowledge of the landscape and the weather and the ice and the dark. The system was the achievement, not superhuman endurance, but human intelligence applied systematically to a hard problem over a very long time. And the system was not perfect. It failed sometimes in the ways that any system operating with thin margins fails. A bad harvest, a severe winter, a livestock disease, an accident on the ice, a fire that went wrong instead of right. The Norse sagas are full of winters that ended badly, of households that did not survive intact to the spring, of the small catastrophes that the system's margins were sometimes not wide enough to absorb. The system was good. It was not invincible. And the people running it knew the difference, which is why the husfrija counted the stores so carefully, and why the farmhand tested the ice with his staff, and why the householder said his quiet words over the carved figure at the evening meal. They were not performing rituals of superstition. They were maintaining, by every means available to them, the thin, bright line between surviving the winter and not. Outside the longhouse, the January night is doing everything it does with complete indifference to what is happening inside. The temperature has dropped further in the clear sky cold, the stars overhead burning in that hard, depthless way that very cold, clear nights produce, each one a point of light so sharp it seems almost aggressive. The snow on the farmyard is settling and compacting under its own weight, its surface crust hardening in the overnight cold until by morning it will hold your weight for a step or two before breaking through into the softer snow beneath. The fjord's edge ice is extending another few centimeters into the dark water, patient and incremental, the cold working its way outward from the shore with a thoroughness that suggests it has all the time in the world, which it does until the solstice turns it back. The solstice. The word arrives in your half-sleeping thoughts with a particular weight, because the solstice is the hinge on which a Norse winter turns, the moment when the darkness reaches its maximum and the light begins, by the smallest possible increments, to return. The winter solstice in Norse culture, the festival of Yule, Jol in Old Norse, was not a minor observance. It was one of the most significant ritual events of the year, a multi-day celebration that acknowledged the depth of the darkness, honored the gods appropriate to the season, reinforced the social bonds of the community through feasting and gift-giving, and marked the turning of the cosmic cycle back toward the light. The Christian Christmas that eventually replaced it borrowed so extensively from Jol, the timing, the fire and light symbolism, the feast, the gifts, the gathering of the community, that the two traditions became almost impossible to fully disentangle, which is either a testament to how deeply Jol was embedded in Northern European cultural practice or a reminder that new religious frameworks tend to be more successful when they can accommodate existing observances rather than simply prohibiting them. The Yule log, the evergreen decorations, the 12 days of celebration, the emphasis on light in the darkest season. All of these carry the residue of the Norse winter festival, the cultural memory of a people who understood, from long and direct experience, that the return of the light was not a metaphor. It was a survival event. The lengthening days of late January and February, each one only a few minutes longer than the last, were the first evidence that the winter's grip was loosening, that the system had held for another year, that the stores would be sufficient, that the animals would survive to spring, that the farm would produce again. The relief that this return produced was not sentimental. It was practical. It was the relief of a household that has been running on careful margins, seeing the margins begin to widen. The relief of a culture that has been holding its breath since October, beginning, very slowly, to exhale. You have not reached that exhale yet. The solstice, if you arrived here in mid-January, is just behind you. The turning has happened, the days are technically getting longer, but the cold does not acknowledge the turning immediately. January and February are often the coldest months even after the solstice, because the Earth's thermal systems lag behind the astronomical calendar, and the Norse knew this too. The knowledge that the light was returning was psychological sustenance rather than immediate physical relief. It meant that the rationing, the careful management, the cold endurance, the long dark evenings filled with stories and work and the quiet acknowledgement of gods. It meant that all of this had a fixed duration, that the darkness was not infinite, that spring existed and was coming, by increments so small they were imperceptible day to day but real and reliable and accumulating toward warmth. This knowledge, that the darkness had a limit, that the cold had a term, that the system had held before and would hold again, was perhaps the most important thing the Norse winter culture transmitted across generations. Not the specific techniques, though the techniques were essential. Not the particular stories, though the stories carried everything. The knowledge that it was survivable, that people had survived it before in this place, in this cold, with these tools and this food and these gods and this fire. That the evidence of their having survived it was all around you, in the longhouse walls, in the stored provisions, in the well-worn sleeping platforms, in the old man who had told the story tonight and who had survived more winters than you could currently count on fingers that are finally warm. The fire in the hearth has settled to its overnight configuration. A deep bed of coals with a few larger pieces of wood burning slowly above them, enough heat radiating outward to hold the room's temperature at something compatible with sleep. The system managing itself through the night the way it has managed itself through every night this winter. You can feel its warmth from here, a steady ambient presence that your body registers as safety and that your mind, unwinding from the day's events, receives as permission to let go. The day you have lived through in this place has been the day of a culture at full operation, every part of it working, every person in their role, every system performing the function it was designed for. The clothing keeping the cold out, the food keeping the hunger back, the architecture keeping the wind off, the stories keeping the identity alive, the rituals keeping the relationship with the world's governing forces maintained, the social hierarchy keeping the household's resources allocated efficiently, the fire keeping the dark outside where the dark belongs. You did not thrive today, in the sense that thriving implies ease and surplus. but you were held. You were inside the system, and the system was working, and the people around you knew their parts in it with a confidence born of inheritance and practice and the long, slow accumulation of a culture's knowledge about how to be alive in this specific, demanding, beautiful, brutal place. The stars through the smoke hole are very bright. Your breath rises in a small, slow cloud and disperses. The dog has shifted in its sleep and is now pressed against the sleeping child with the full length of its warm body, providing heat with the straightforward generosity of an animal that knows what it has to offer. The fire breathes. The wind moves over the roof of the longhouse with a sound like the sea, like distance, like something enormous and patient passing overhead and continuing on into the dark. You are still here. You are warm. The night is long but not infinite. The cold is real but not absolute. The darkness is deep but already, by the smallest imaginable fraction, beginning its long retreat. And here, in the last of the firelight, as the longhouse settles fully into its nighttime quiet, let the day release you. Let the weight of the axe handle leave your hands. Let the cold of the farmyard and the sting of the ice wind and the careful tension of the path finding across the frozen landscape. Let all of it soften now, the way the fire softens the room, the way the darkness softens the edges of everything it touches. You carried a lot today. A bucket, a load of wood, a long walk in the cold, the unfamiliar weight of a world that asked more of your body than you are used to giving. Set it all down now, here, in the warmth of the hearth's last good glow. The Norse people who slept in this place before you and after you and in every winter that this building stood. They set it down too, every night, the same letting go. The work was always there in the morning. The cold was always there in the morning. The fire needed tending, and the animals needed feeding, and the stores needed counting, and the ice needed breaking, and all of it was there in the morning, patient and undramatic and requiring. But not now. Now was the time for the body to do its own deep, essential work, the restoration that sleep provides, the slow repair of the muscles that carried the day, the consolidation of everything the mind received and processed and filed in the long hours of wakefulness. Outside, the winter holds the world in its quiet, cold, star-bright grip, indifferent and immense and temporary, as all winters are temporary, retreating in the end before the returning light, the warming ground, the first green thing pushing through the snow with the unstoppable conviction of something that knows the season has turned in its favor. That light is coming, slowly, incrementally, reliably, the way all the best things come, without announcement, without drama, in the small daily accumulation of something getting better by degrees so tiny you cannot see them moving, only look back and realize, one morning, that the darkness is shorter than it was, that the air is different, that the world has quietly, while you were sleeping and working and eating and listening to stories and tending the fire, kept its oldest promise. Sleep now. The longhouse holds you. The fire holds the dark holds the stars. And the stars, cold and clear and impossibly numerous, hold the whole long night in their ancient, patient light. The same light that fell on the Norse farmyard and the sleeping household and the dreaming dog and the smoke rising from the roof hole 1,000 years ago, unchanged, unhurried, burning quietly above everything that lives and endures and waits for morning. The fire breathes out. You breathe in. Let go. Sweet dreams.